areas of passive and low energy architecture. And it was in relation to that that I went to Hungary in 1986. And in a provincial town in Hungary, I saw this amazing creative architecture. And since it's a small country, it didn't take long to meet the architects and to begin to understand where they were coming from. So if we can start with the first slide. Hungarian architecture is probably a subject that we wouldn't expect a lot of interest in. And I think there's the general idea that that part of Europe that was cut off for so many years is really a blank. It's a blank in the minds of the people who lived there, and it's also a blank in terms of our culture and what we did in all of those years, that there was an Iron Curtain. And I would like to suggest that we have a lot to learn, and it's more than just a fascination with curious and interesting architectural forms. Now, the forward is not working. I labeled this as sustainable practice because it seems to me that this is the depth behind these wonderful images. We're already in a second generation of these architects who invented what they call organic architecture, and I won't try to describe that. Another word they use is living architecture. And as you will understand, the word living is very closely related to sustainability as a word. Now, by what I mean sustainable practice, first of all, it ought to be the practice of architecture that has a future. And one has to say that for many architects, including some friends of mine in both Europe and in the New World, there's a very uncertain future for those architects who are in conventional practice. A second meaning of sustainable practice would be that the next generation is being trained by the current generation, a kind of fraternity between generations that assures a continuity. And this the Hungarians are also doing. But beyond that, they're practicing sustainability in both of the senses of human resources and natural resources. And at the moment, this word sustainability seems to be a very popular one. It seems like it mostly is to involve a respect for natural resources. But of course, human resources are another part of that equation. So there are really four ways of talking about sustainability. Now, we all fall victim of hero worship. We love stars. We love the one-liner, the great facade. So here it is. We'll get it over with. This is Makowicz, who is the only one of these architects. And there's a whole body of architecture from this last generation, from 20 or 25-year period. This is a community center in Sáros-Patak. And let me read you what a British critic said about this building. A friendly dragon with drooping eyes and long sensual lashes, its scaly arms outstretched around a courtyard embracing visitors. Under its great beetling brows, the hooded eyes of the building watch its visitors. A creature that has slunk out of some fairy tale Transylvanian forest and made its way to slumber into a provincial town square. That's Jonathan Glancy in 1984. Now, we're all entitled to our fantasies. Let me read you what the architect had to say about this building. Inner man is spoiled by rapidly expanding technology and constant anxiety about the threat of all-out war. Celebration and human dignity are doubtful. I'm afraid there is no holding an unbalanced mankind from abandoning civilization. A balance can be preserved only by having a relationship between the inner man and the other orders of creation. This building represents the formal entry of nature and prehistoric culture into our present day. Now, of course, to our eyes, one of the elementary things that we should be able to recognize without so much passion is the great importance of the sheltering roof. And if there's a single architectural idea in all of this stuff, it's the importance of the roof, the sheltering of the roof. And in this case, you notice how the stair opens up its arms and welcomes you into the upstairs. Now, Hungary as a country, I always feel I need to show a map because some people don't know what continent it's in. This is its present circumstances, and there are two very important dates in terms of modern Hungary. First is 1919, and on that date, the Treaty of the Petit Trianon was signed, in which Hungary lost 60% of its territory and 2/3 of its population. So all of the fringes were nibbled off to contribute to other countries. This is the so-called Balkan solution that we're still living through in how, well, what's happening in what used to be Yugoslavia. So 1919 is the first date, and obviously this has enormous economic as well as cultural repercussions to divide a country like that. And then secondly is the tragic, absolutely pathetic Hungarian uprising of 1956. Now, the pivot of my story is this date because the leaders of this movement, who call themselves organic architects, they were like you. They were in school at this moment. So they were in professional, in the technical university. There is only one place to study architecture in Hungary. And they were in their formative years, and many of them carried rifles during that revolution. Now, there's some other issues, and in this case, we do need to see what's on the ceiling. It's familiar graphics. This is a story also about 20th century culture. It's about the city versus the country, or the country versus the city. And here we see it. This woman in the foreground is a criminal because she is peddling something on the streets. This was illegal in 1986. And she's selling embroidery. She's coming from a remote village, and that village has been condemned to be destroyed because they all have thatch roofs. And the village decided to sell their cultural property, which in this case is their family treasures of embroidery. And so they are selling them in the street, and the police are allowing this to happen so that they can replace their roofs with clay tile, and therefore the village survived. Now, we all know about cities. Most of us are city types. Cities are progressive. They're adventurous. They're cosmopolitan. They're international. And then there's the country. Countryside, as you know, is conservative. It's backward. The plumbing is not very good. But keep in mind that the country is where the culture changes the slowest. So if you're looking for ancient culture, you must look in the countryside, not in the city. Now, many countries have embroidery, but embroidery happens to be one of those themes that is particular in some of its patterns to Hungarian folk culture. Behind this is the origins of the Hungarians as a people. They came to Europe 1,000 years ago as a series of horse-riding tribes out of Central Asia. They have a background which is totally alien to any of the peoples around them. They speak a strange language. So they're surrounded on the west by Germanic-speaking people and on the east by Slavic people. They're an island. And before that, there was the Celtic culture, which was a common culture that underlays Europe and parts of Asia before the classical era. And the glimmers of the Celts or the Celts also come through in some of this work. Now, you don't have to be very bright to see what was happening in Hungary in the 1960s. It was happening in many other European countries and both sides of the Iron Curtain, and it had to do with building housing. It really started in the 1950s, building housing that was destroyed, as well as new housing necessary after the Second World War. And this was accomplished through mechanization, through factory-produced housing in which people are put in these filing cabinets. England perhaps didn't have as bad a case of this disease as some other countries, but it is found especially in all of the capital cities of Europe. And so you contrast the quality of a building from 100 or 200 years ago versus what we have, what was currently being built. And they could see their culture disappearing. Now, of course, architects are good at building symbolically, and they were called on to build, if you like, ornaments. And this is one of the early buildings built, designed, this is 1972, by this group. The one thing one might say about it in terms of its grounding is that the colored tile is made within a kilometer of this building and is the famous Zolnay ceramics that were developed in the last part of the 19th century. So this is a little park pavilion in Pécs. But in terms of the origin of trying to rediscover their roots and of turning around the built environment, there are fundamentally two streams. And one of these streams really comes out of one of the very large centralized design offices. Every architect had to work in a centralized office. And this was in Pécs, where they realized that they were getting stale, and they deliberately formed a young studio. They invited a bunch of students, all who graduated from the same class from the Technical University in Budapest, and they invited those students to join the studio in this provincial city. And after they were there for some time, they managed to convince the manager of the office to also invite their professor. And so this was a kind of a design unit which ultimately became called the Pécs Group. In 1973, they put on an exhibition and published this manifesto. And they asked the question, they said, why is our culture disappearing? After all, architecture is solid, and it's all around us. They said, our traditional culture in music with people like Bartók is really alive. What's wrong with architecture? What are we missing? They said, everything we know, we learned from nature. And that's a beautiful phrase that counts for all of us. And they published a couple of proposals. They looked at the tulip, a national flower, and the poppy, which is very popular. And they took an architectural analogy and they designed and built a building which was seminal. It is a kind of icon of this movement. Now, if I were to tell you that this is a pump house, you may not believe it, but this is the program. There are very few architects, very few teams of architects who have bothered to design a pump house, to design an electrical substation, or similar utilitarian needs. This is in the forest. There's no road to it. Very few people have seen this building, and it took 4 years to build. The designers ended up having to do a lot of the construction themselves, because one of the aspects of communist Hungary, as it was in all of the countries behind the Iron Curtain, is that everybody was looked after. Everybody had a job. Everybody got more or less the same pay. So it's one of these things, everybody had a job, but nobody worked. There was no reward for those people who developed their skill, those people who could work faster, those people who could work better. In our system in the West, if you work faster, if you work better, you get paid more, you get promoted, but not in their socialist system. I like the way in which the concrete here is very rough and has almost an antique quality. And then up above is the stem. There's only 2 rooms. Down below is where the pumps are, and up in the flower part is a recreation room, because there needs to be somebody in this building for 24 hours. This is the employees' rest room. There's only a single window. It's a skylight up at the very top, a geodesic dome, which connects the zenith of the sky with the spring, which is the purest of water, which is coming directly out of the ground. It makes this vertical axis, which connects the most fundamental life-giving fluid with the cosmos. Now again, one looks at something like this and realizes it was achieved with extraordinary effort. It took a lot of time. It's an enormous investment for the modest amount of shelter that it produces. So surely its value then comes from the metaphysical and not the physical. And this is indeed part of the background of why not just their designs, but their designing is sustainable, that it brings life and it brings other values aside from all of the physical ones. Now this is the sort of photograph that you will see on the tourist literature. This is this cutesy Hungarian peasant cottage. It's usually built out of mud. It's cob construction or adobe construction with a thatch roof. And it's curious that at the same time that this movement was beginning, there was also the beginning of museum houses, folk culture, collections of houses from the 19th century that were kept intact. Now, the official reason to do that was to demonstrate to the people how much better it was to live in one of those apartment buildings with plumbing than to live in a mud house with no plumbing. The Page Group saw this as their architectural heritage, and they talked about it in many different ways. In this diagram, we see the family relationship between houses and barns and even churches and church steeples. Down at the very bottom is a positive-negative study showing the shape of the inside space in a house. And on another plate, they talk about architecture, the traditional architecture consisting of 3 things, and they always begin at first with the space which encloses man, which protects man, which is buried in the earth. And they're talking about the earth walls coming up, as well as you being surrounded by earth. And then the second element is the structural element that spans across that space. And then the third element is the roof, the crowning silhouette against the sky. And they also talk about the way in which buildings traditionally rose up out of the ground, and literally they did because they were made out of earth, and reached into the sky, and then through their life and after their life, they then went back into the earth. And they talked about this way, both physically and also metaphysically. And of course, their traditional architecture is then based on local materials, it's based on earth, and it's based on fiber, which is trees, grass. And they commented on modern buildings, and these are all illustrations from this manifesto and exhibition from the beginning of 1973. And on the extreme right, they're moving out of a traditional house and into one that actually has a second story on it. And they're showing how, as the building gets taller, it loses the intimacy of its direct contact with the earth, but simultaneously it becomes removed from the earth and becomes totally anonymous. And they looked at chairs, like you're sitting in, and they looked at traditional chairs, which always have a back, and the back is just one plank, one board, and which is always carved. And the carving is always different, it seems. And the text that goes with this is very, very short and concise. It says, "You carved your humanity into wood." And the analogy is the great diversity of every individual being indeed an individual, even though we're cut from the same material. How can this lesson apply to a multi-story building? They're trying now to address the problem of the time, which was housing in factory-built precast concrete slabs. And they came up with the mathematics of if you had 7 or 8 different profiles, what is the combination? And it runs into the thousands of combinations and permutations in which the architecture could be enriched. Now keep in mind that this work is being done by this small group, which is recently graduated university students, together with a professor who fought in the uprising. And they're working as a cell inside a large collective office. And they got an opportunity to build this. And by 1976, there was enough built that it was published, and it caused a national uproar. And in particular, the university professors were instructed by the party to sort of intellectually demolish this business and to take to task these ideas. In Hungary, they talk about the Tulip Wars because every week there would be letters published back and forth, the dialogue about how offensive this was or how creative this was and how this was a step toward a more original architecture, an architecture that you might want to live in. As a result, the young studio was disbanded. So they were distributed among a whole bunch of other centralized offices, and they tried to break up this idea of having a more humane built environment. The other stream is the stream which Makowitz primarily created together with the studios and friends associated with him. And here we have a village community center which dates from the late 70s and early 80s. And let me read you what he has to say about this. Well, first of all, he says, we didn't choose the model of a cute little Hungarian village. We chose the model of a forest. From the trees of our partly depleted, trackless forest, we have built a many-branched new center, a home for the community. We did not take our occasionally emergent memories of the, quote, beautiful old Hungarian village, end of quote, as our model, but rather the healing and reappearing woods. So that we may find ourselves a home, we preserve the house of the annihilated Jew and the corrupting, plainer, modern buildings as well, under the protection of a new roof. And so the story is that there was the remains of a peasant house, which a Jewish family had been dragged away during the Second World War and never came back. And that house was sort of haunted. It had been used for community rooms, but it was too small. Nearby, there was a modernist box, a strip development with a little restaurant and a barber shop, and you can see it in the shadows on the right-hand side. So what Makowicz did was come in with this great roof, and he wrapped it around, and behind and above, then he created this, here are the trees, the living trees and the dead trees, talking to each other. And this is the interior, so that those two earlier buildings are absorbed within this great multi-use space, and one also can get up in the roofs of those former buildings. There are all kinds of smaller rooms off on the side. This sort of building was done without any official sanction and with every obstruction possible. So first of all, there are no state funds. This is a matter of community leadership in which the architects themselves, of course they worked without fees, they probably paid off with potatoes, in which it was a kind of teamwork and in which the village built itself its own center. In talking with Makowicz about this building and many others, he used the word which gets translated into English, shit, that these buildings are built of shit materials. They're built of materials that nobody else wants. They're useless materials. And if you think about it, if you're building outside of the system, then that's the only materials that are available. There's no steel, there's no cut stone, there are none of those materials that one normally thinks of as being appropriate materials for real architecture. This is another village, and so he himself found himself and his colleagues involved in something like 25 different villages, each a separate program in trying to revitalize the villages which were being really eliminated as part of the political process of centralization during the 1960s and the 1970s. This is the little village of Bach. There's some agriculture, and there's a sawmill in this village. This is the plan and elevation of this community center. In this community, there was a war memorial to those people who were killed in the First World War. And on that obelisk, there was what we would call a spread eagle, which is the symbol in Hungary for an ancient totemic bird, the turtle. And in this village, that image was removed, as it was systematically removed in every village in the country. So this is the erasing of memory. And so here the architect took that image and made the plan. You never see the image, but you know it's there. You see it on the screen, of course. And so this is his way of building a memory, and everybody in the village who worked on this building knows it's there. The building itself takes the form of a great bird. The boards, as you can see, are getting dark. There's moss growing on them. There are birds, swallows, all kinds of swallows that make their nest in underneath these boards. So it really is a kind of a birdhouse as well as looking like one. And then at the entrance, if you look in the shadow, you'll see there are doorposts. There's one showing here, again with the head of the eagle. And the eagle in the Hungarian language has a double meaning, the word. It also means doorpost. So he's returning to the ancient language and demonstrating the association of words and parts of a traditional Hungarian house. This, of course, is a community house. On the interior, we have a kind of almost formula which, to some degree, I suppose, was forced by the restraint of building materials. So the low parts of the building are heavy and massive, and they're built out of whatever is available, old brick, adobe or mud, or in some cases concrete. But it's always rough work, and it's typically plastered over. But this is a heavy masonry base. And above this, the darkened parts are the parts that are built out of wood. And the wood is always cheap, and it's stuff that didn't enter into the main market. It's soft wood of very poor structural quality. And in the conception of the building, then you can see that the colors are reversed. So the lower part, which is the heavy part, is white, reflects light, and the light part, in terms of its weight, is stained very dark, up in the shadows. And from a services point of view, all the services are buried in the lower part, which is fireproof. And again, they had access to very poor lighting fixtures, very poor wiring, not much in terms of plumbing. Very elementary stuff, which of course could go wrong, but at least it's not going to set the building on fire. And the top part then is to some degree saved from having those accidents from service. And this is in the upstairs of the same building, looking down out of the shadows. So this is inside the community center at Bach. And again, it was built over a 2-year period, not by professional builders, deliberately not done by contractors, but built by local workers. So they were working outside of the system, not just in who the clients were, and also they didn't have any budgets, and all of these buildings were built without the money in hand to finish them. But there was the courage to begin it. And unlike some other countries where buildings are sometimes begun and never finished, here, generally, these buildings have persevered. This is the only one that still may be a little bit incomplete. This is another community center in a very small town in the southwest part of Hungary, where the local mayor, you may think he's very simple-minded, but he realized there was no dignified place for him to take his wife out to get dressed up and to go out on a Saturday night. Just no place in town. And so he decided that that's what his town needed. And they looked at all the alternatives of building a community center out at the edge of town, making a new complex, of building it on the battleground. But no, in the end, they decided to put it in the very center of town, right against the highway that goes through, to really intensify the density of the village. And this building has stood unfinished for several years, and when they found more money, they would come back to it. Now, the process of building then is to deliberately find local builders who are paid a nominal wage, very small wages, and when you pay people so little, it doesn't make any difference whether they work 4 hours or 8 hours or 10 hours. They just work and they're paid. Similarly, so for instance, if you go on the job site with the architect, all the work stops. Everybody stops working, and people come around to talk to the architect, and he encourages this because it's a teamwork. This is not production as we understand building, but in their case, it is a community effort. But in this case, The idea of doing a general sketch and leaving many of the details for the workmen themselves to work out on the job site backfired, because these workmen were just not skilled enough, and they became discouraged and angry, and they fought with each other, which of course means that they really cared. And this took a major effort to turn it around. The architects took buses and took the village workmen to other cities and showed them the buildings that they had built in other cities and towns and villages, and showed them what was possible. So the idea is that you don't pay people off with money, but you pay them off with pride. So everybody in this town who worked in this building will tell his children and grandchildren that he worked on this major building. And this building is exceptional. That's why the village leaders seek these architects. They don't want one of those ordinary, and if you like, ugly buildings. This shows the kind of extreme using very thin pieces of wood, and they're really pushing it from a structural point of view. You'll notice that the structure is symmetrical. It's very, very regular, and to get the quantity of space necessary for a theater with its stage, you have two overlapping, intersecting domes. Now, Makowicz himself, along the way, got so fed up with working with centralized offices, working with all of the bureaucrats who there, like here, like everywhere that we ever try to build, seem to get in the way of both the creative process as well as the process of getting buildings built. And he spent a period of 8 years, which he says are the happiest years of his life, in the forest, essentially being the only architect in a national forest thinking and working alone. And there was the concept by the director of this national forest, which is only 25 kilometers north of Budapest. It's the Pilis National Forest in Visegrad. The manager, the director of this national forest, had the idea that not only did the forest belong to the nation, but that people should use it physically. Now, in the good old days, everybody in Budapest had a summer house, and Budapest is empty during the summer because it gets to be pretty unpleasant. But of course, during the communist period, this was no longer so possible. And so here they deliberately built a series of shelters to encourage families to come to the park for their vacation for a couple of weeks in a camping mode, rather than have individual summer houses. And here then is where Makowicz really developed his love affair with trees and with wood. This is a nature study center, which when it was finished in 1988, he said this was his finest building. As you can see, it's a dome-like building, and it has this earth-covered spherical shape, which automatically give you some kinds of associations, but especially with landforms, and particularly with tombs with prehistoric culture. And very deliberately, the nature center then is embraced by the earth. Swinging gates, which open it up. The building, here we have the doorposts as eagles. And the building is laid out according to the cardinal points and in relationship to the sunrise and sunsets of the solstices and the equinoxes. So it's automatically aligned with the patterns of nature. And the great shields, in this case, are the signs of the zodiac. And of course, there are 12 ribs as you move around. So light is coming in through the very top, and it's also coming in through a ring of secondary rooms around the perimeter. This is by a very young architect as the entrance to another one of the national forests. This is the Buk National Forest, or beech forest. And the entrance to the forest is across a small meadow that's completely undistinguished, and then behind it are the wooded hills. And as you can see here, he's played with wood as a silhouette against the sky, kind of saber shapes, which are carved and notched according to very traditional designs. But working with straight-line generators, he's making a fantastically complex form against the sky. Now, I've mentioned sustainability in terms of the continuity of generations, and I've already mentioned how one of these professors and his students formed this cell, the Page group. With Makowicz, he understood the importance of living and working with nature so strongly that he initiated a summer school which began in 1981. And this was completely independent of the only school of architecture in the country, which of course is the Technical University in Budapest. And this is a very unusual summer school. The students come, of course, voluntarily. There are no teachers. There are no professors. The students run the program. And typically, students come for several years in a row. And the goal is to explore, but to build something cooperatively. So it's an exercise in teamwork at every level. And they build using only the resources of the national park. So in this case, as you see, they're using roots and saplings. This summer school has continued every year then since 1981. And the students, if they want to hear from Makowicz or if they want to hear from somebody else, they'll invite them. But otherwise, they run the show themselves. And this is real tough. It was especially tough in the early years because in those years you never knew who was listening to what you were saying. So the whole system was interlaced with spies, and there was no place where one perhaps could be himself. So it was a very important place to completely get away. Here we have the drawings for, maybe could you make this one smaller so that we can get the whole thing on the screen. This is a dance pavilion for a summer camp, and this again was built by the participants in the summer camp, which is a retreat. And you'll notice the symmetry of the frame. You'll obviously not miss the imagery. These things are not easy to build, I don't have to tell you. And they're also not so easy to draw, and the relationship between drawing and building is complex. He didn't get a building permit for this. The architect worked out what he wanted to do. They built it in one summer, and after it was built, he did the drawings and then submitted the drawings to get the building permit. Now, this is already 1986, and in the 80s, one begins to get the slide. One begins to get the softening of the system, and also one begins to get more resources because economically the country is becoming more prosperous. So this is the, they like to call it the dancing barn, but it's a barn for dancing, the dance barn. And this is one of the second generation of architects, someone who trained with Makowicz. His name is Eckler, but he works alone. And one of the curious things is that architects in Budapest, you show them a picture of this, they don't believe it. They can't imagine that this is in their country. They can't imagine how it could have been built, especially when it was built. So this gives you some illustration of the courage and conviction of architects to work for very little in terms of fees, but to participate at every level, not just of the conception and design, but through all of the processes until the building is intact in place. And this is the framing on the inside. Another building, and this is the one that I began with, is in a small village at the far eastern end of Hungary. So this is near the corner of where Romania and Russia and the Ukraine come together. And it's a part of the country that was always ignored because the village is only a kilometer from the border. And finally, in the late 80s, it was decided that it was reasonable to invest something in this village. The last major building in this village was the church in the background, which was built in the 13th century. And so that's the building that they're trying to relate to. So here there were some old modern planar international style school houses which were overbuilt and embraced together with the new construction. And again, they started this without having all the money in hand, and the site stood idle for a few years. And here, notice the leaning concrete columns. Here they are with the building finished. Again, this is a young architect whose name you would not have heard. He's the second generation working in one of the studios that are attached to Makowitz, but working quite independently. Now you'll notice this building, like all of the others, is daylit. And again, it's using cheap softwood, and it's capitalizing on intricacy of craftsmanship, which, if you may notice, is becoming more and more sophisticated. Because as the decades wear on, the builders are becoming more accomplished. And then there is the great building by Makowitz, which almost brings this period to a conclusion, the church in Paks, which, as you and I look at this, what do we see? We see a heart. But in other cultures, they would look at it and they would see a lyre, or they would see a double spiral. They see the mirror reflection of an S-curve. It's a kind of a universal decorative form which Makowitz seized upon for this Catholic church. The idea being Catholic, being universal, and all-embracing, and that it should include life-giving forms. But that heart, you never see it except when you get inside, and here there is a heart-shaped skylight seen where the timbers are breaking out to support the roof. Notice that here, even though the building is symmetrical, the timbers are now rotating, so they're being conceived and built truly three-dimensionally. And this is the kind of thing that's very difficult to show in drawings. It requires intimate contact between the architect to give confidence as well as to give information to the builders on a continuous basis. So it's a very small church for 100 people. These little domes inside are for secondary purposes like baptism and for classroom use. Natural light, untreated wood, and a sculptor. Now, I almost hesitated to put these last few slides in because the architecture in so many countries is so, the public architecture is so interrelated with private architecture, with the design of the one-family house. And especially in the United States, the one-family house is how young architects really get started and prove themselves and sort of grow their muscles in terms of training. That was theoretically just not possible in communist Hungary because theoretically there were no single-family houses to be built. That was not part of the national plan. In fact, there were thousands of small houses built in the countryside throughout this period, but they never ever had any architects. They were built using mud brick and using traditional materials, and they were also built without a mortgage. And they were built outside of the system by villagers, and they were so small and so on that the authorities essentially didn't close them down. But of course, in the city, you'd never be able to get away with this. Now, in the late 80s, the design of one-family houses, both on commission and also to build one for yourself, becomes a more open event. This is an architect, a very conservative architect, building for himself. He's only building as he collects the money. So there's no money borrowed, no mortgage. He's building outside of the system. He's also building using materials that are unprocessed, that are natural. So the reeds come from nearby Lake Balaton. You can see the mud bricks. I guess the design certainly is very conservative. There are other architects who are perhaps wealthier in terms of ideas and also in terms of hiring craftsmen who, on the one hand, were designing and building those same kind of awful glass towers that we see all over the world in major cities. But when they went to the countryside, they would build in country style, although in this case, as you can see, it's been brought up to date. And there's some houses that are sort of sleepers. This was quite an early one in the early 80s. It's built of adobe, and superficially it just looks like another cottage. But there's some subtlety about it. It's rammed earth, and the walls, while there's a sharp edge, the walls all have a very slight bow, and there are a whole series of subtleties. Look at the eave line. It's not straight. It has this gentle swelling. So life is coming into these natural materials and putting the materials into motion, again, in a remote village. This is the interior, a traditional Hungarian stove, which works using thermal mass, and open fireplace kind of stove, and a loft up above, so that even on the outside it looks very ordinary. On the inside it really opens from north to south. The south is a continuous greenhouse, and it also has this loft space. And this, which is probably the most sophisticated of the houses of the early 80s, which again is adobe. This is mud construction. Therefore, you'll notice, if you look carefully, the walls are not equal, the walls are not straight, all of the curved lines are not regular, and it has a thatch roof. So this is traditional materials really being pushed into the late 20th century. The single window is really a cylinder which becomes a greenhouse, and of course plants love that kind of situation. So the whole view of the world is out through the lens, and it really is a lens, of that single great window. In the back of the house are these three windows which shine into the attic, and they're aimed at the winter solstice, the equinox, and the summer solstice, sunrise. So it's tied back to the cosmos as well as being built of the earth. And this is the experience next to the greenhouse. And again, a traditional Hungarian stove being built into the center of the house. This is a house built for one of the most prominent of the Communist Party leaders, and it was for him and his children. And it's like a cluster of yurts. Of course, there's a high wall around it, and there are those barking police dogs and so on. But he, too, was adventurous by the mid-1980s. Now, what architects would do is, or there was a very prominent jeweler who commissioned a custom house. The architects would charge 10 or 15% for that work. But simultaneously, they were working in the villages for nothing. So they were letting Peter pay for Paul. This period concludes with 1991-92. In 1991, the Hungarian Pavilion was designed for Expo 1992 for Seville, and here is a truly Hungarian building. It has nothing to do with the Mediterranean whatsoever. I mean, if you're building in Seville, what are you doing with a black roof? So it's, if you like, it's anti-sustainability in terms of passive heating and cooling. You have these billowing hills, impenetrable, of black tile, and then piercing them are a series of 7 church steeples, or stylizations of church steeples. The core of the exhibit was the tree, an oak tree. And in terms of the whole expo, in terms of popular success, as you know, world exhibitions are these kinds of competitions of architects who can build the most memorable building. Most people, in the end, didn't get so turned on by the buildings, but there were 2 natural items that everybody remembered. One was the iceberg that came from Chile. An iceberg spent the whole summer in Seville. And the other was the dead tree, the Hungarian tree, which also has its roots, and it stands in a glass floor. So it symbolized, by being dead, it symbolized life, and it was a very intense moment because the building, there were no other exhibits. It was the building and the dead tree, and then the whole thing was orchestrated with music and sound and light. And one moved through the building in a kind of procession, in a series of chambers, each of which not only were designed architecturally, but the sound and light show that accompanied them. They thereby avoided the problem of doing something in one language or another. It was in the universal languages of architecture and music. Now, suddenly, we see asymmetry. Virtually all of the buildings I've shown you are symmetrical. There's something to do about stability and structural resolution, as well as a sense of wholeness that is common to all of these buildings. This building, too, is symmetrical structurally. So it has these great bent beams that go from one side to another up to a ridge. But the diagonal that cuts across subdivides the space in a very unusual way. It's a slash, and rising up out of the slash are these steeples. At this moment, and this moment is 1991 when these decisions were made, the last Russian left Hungary, and suddenly this underground kind of architecture became the official representative of Hungary, first at the Venice Biennale, and then in this building that showed the world that we are something that you did not expect, which is what the brochure said at Seville. Now, with 1991, the whole scene changes. The political system is turned upside down, and suddenly, for a moment, this seems like it's the official architecture. And that becomes another story, except for me to tell you that at that moment, all of the large offices, the centralized offices, were sold off or disappeared. They disintegrated because the system changed. These offices, which had been operating and gradually building up, thrived. And even today, what little architectural work there is comes very strongly to these offices that are practicing in this way. This is an illustration from that manifesto, which was called "Only from Pure Sources," which is a quotation from an ancient legend. And there were no words to this, and you can read it as you please, but I've discussed it with the architects who drew it. And it shows we're losing the top and the bottom. And maybe could you make the picture smaller? Because in this case, the top and the bottom do have. So you can see that the top and the bottom are the same. You have a natural and an original landscape in which it's very difficult to see the architecture. And then second from the top, we see the impact of modernism. We see the impact of the international style, of a global economy, of the packaging of people and of work. And then we see the beginning of a kind of softening in which, through time, the buildings become softer and gradually become integrated with the earth and finally disappear. And so here we have a long-term statement that may, in fact, run through many generations to suggest that the moment that they were addressing was only the first step, and that our responsibility is to live more completely in harmony with our natural landscape. So those are the images that went through the that accompany the development of this unique practice of an underground movement in Hungary. So I thank you very much and would welcome your questions. Any questions? Anybody ready to move to Hungary? Maybe I should explain that I'm not Hungarian. I don't speak the language. And my interest in this was not, of course, to begin with, it was the fascination with the forms, but, and because I've written about organic architecture, I was very curious about it. Initially, these architects were inspired by the American architects, Frank Lloyd Wright and Bruce Goff and Herb Green, etc. And that's where they got the word from. But they couldn't read English because they're of that generation that had to speak Russian as a second language. And needless to say, they refused to learn it. So they could only speak Hungarian, and I don't speak Russian. So they could only see the American work through pictures.
It's very odd, though, receiving that into our consciousness, because it has a kind of primitivism, an atavism, which is inherent, as you say, in certain work in the organic tradition in the United States, and even with Rudolf Steiner and anthroposophy and so on, which were other sources for this particular group. I just wonder whether one of the problems there is about receiving that into a thoroughly westernized culture, one soaked in the tradition of modernism and its changes into different aspects of modernism, is the unalienable sort of quality of much of the work, that it is very difficult to cope with, isn't it, architecturally and psychologically. And it also tells us, I think, about other traditions within the framework of what you've shown. I mean, traditions which relate to mythology, presumably to deep understandings of their own Magyar traditions. Could you say a little bit about the traditional aspect of it and the way that affects the forms and the development of the forms in the way they've occurred?
Well, I guess from an elementary point of view, you will notice that it's a fairly strong architecture in terms of its textures and as well as from its forms, because you need strong forms to carry those textures. And from many points of view, a lot of this was expedience. They didn't have a choice in terms of materials. And the detailing in some cases is relatively crude. The way they began, they really began without any teachers. So they had to teach themselves. And they refused to take in old-time architects, such as sometimes happens with a new generation. They will take in the old-timers. They won't design in a neo-Georgian way, but they learn from a neo-Georgian old-timer how to detail windows or how to put flashing on a roof and so on. So there's that part of the materiality of it. I don't, well, at least to begin with, they did not choose these materials for ecological reasons. So it's very easy to look at this stuff and talk about sustainability and say this is green architecture. And it would be it would be very easy to fool you that way, because this is green architecture, but it's not coming with greenness like we do. But it grew out of the necessity. The question about the different culture is really tough to address. And I hardly know how to talk to it. The Hungarian language only became formalized in the middle of the 19th century, although through the years they steadfastly refused. Well, the German would have been the logical choice in terms of official languages, and they were very reticent about using German as an official language, you know, in terms of running government and so on, because they would lose their identity.
But they did have the connection back with Kosovo and the things that were happening at the end of the century, at the end of the last century.
Oh, absolutely.
What I had in mind was, you know, when Bela Bartok went around
Right.
the villages,
Yes.
a previous adventure, I can't quite remember when, presumably that was around the turn of the century too.
Right.
He was collecting references to music that had a tradition, and then combining them together in a modern interpretation, if I understand it correctly,
Yeah.
of those sources. And Cecil Sharp did the same thing in Britain. Bela Bartok's idea was to present to a modern world a living tradition, a sustainable tradition.
Right, right.
I wondered whether that was also seen in that light, that they went out and collected motifs or mythologies which could be translated into architectural symbols like that helmet form and the bird's forms and so on. And whether that became a significant motive in terms of the way they developed their design ideas.
They did. I can't say that it was quite as self-conscious as Bartok, because as you know, Bartok has this world reputation for preserving. I don't know what the quantity is. It's an enormous wad of traditional music from many cultures, from the many cultures that were part of the old Hungarian kingdom. With these architects, they're coming from a slightly different place. First of all, ethnology, if we can call it that, or the study of folkways, has quite a strong tradition in Hungary because, like language, that was studied fairly intensively beginning at the end of the 19th century. And so there were continuous books published about not just embroidery, but folk costumes and special festivals and utensils that were used in the kitchen, all kinds of folkways, including ways of building, designs of not just houses, but all of the supporting buildings in terms of rural culture. So that repository was there. But these architects deliberately looked at that stuff afresh. So they would go on sketching expeditions. They went to the west, up in the hills, which are the border with Austria, which is very sparsely populated, and there's some wonderful villages in through there. And the other direction they went was into Transylvania, which is today part of Romania, and quite inaccessible and mountainous. And they went there again to sketch, because it's believed today that the purest Hungarian traditions are still alive in Transylvania. And maybe I should mention that for us Westerners, we have the idea that to finish our education in a general way, and especially as an architect, we must go to the classic centers. So we must go and spend some time maybe in Florence, maybe in Venice, but surely to Rome and probably to Athens. We should go back to those roots of our lineage, of our traditions, which are assumed to be classical. And I'm speaking about the United States as well as in Britain. There's this tradition that comes at least from the 18th century. In Hungary, the tradition is not to go to Rome, but it's to go to Transylvania. And a student would go either his year out, he would take a year out of university, or he would go the year after he would graduate, and he may only go for a series of summers, or he may go and spend a whole year. And you would go hitchhiking, knapsack, and you know, you'd bum around. But this was considered the final touch. It's more than icing on the cake, but it's the final touch to your education as a Hungarian. And this is so that I think from a formal point of view is how the thing came alive. There was also a very strong attempt to tie into that previous generation from the turn of the century in the Art Nouveau, where Hungarians developed a very original architecture because they were not Western, and they also are not exactly Eastern. And their version of Art Nouveau is very refreshing, and I find it much stronger than the secessionist, what we call secessionist, which is the Viennese version of Art Nouveau. But that stuff all got wiped out by 1919 because the country went into psychological as well as economic collapse when the country was collapsed. But there was the one hero who I can only identify him as their equivalent of a Frank Lloyd Wright, and this is Kos, K-O-S, who, when Transylvania was removed and put into Romania, he went there, and he tried to organize the villages, and he became a village hero. There is this kind of tradition, Dennis. You just stimulate me. Makowitz, I mentioned earlier, is the one sort of star, one hero of this approach to architecture, whose name we may know, and who lectured about a month ago in the RIBA. Makowitz is a hero in his own country, but not as an architect. He's recognized as a patriot because very early he spoke out against all the craziness that was happening in his country. And he would get interviewed, and he would go on television, and he was a public figure. He stood up, and people respected him for that, and he was so visible that the authorities couldn't shut him up. It would have been they would have made a martyr out of him, and that would have been even more disastrous. And in sort of preparing my mind for tonight, I thought, well, who do we know? Because most architects are real pussyfoots. They're cautiously tippy-toeing around the political system, never up front. Now, maybe Richard Rogers is to some degree an exception. That maybe he. It's
Richard Rogers hasn't been expelled like Malcolm for
No.
years to the forest.
Oh, that's true. No, he lived very nicely as part of the elite, the architectural elite, and now some other. But at least he's speaking in a public forum, and he's recognized by the public, and he talks about some public values, which very few architects are willing to take a stand on. In Hungary, that is always the case. But let me go back to one other thing, and then that is that this is architecture of the country, they may be cities, they may be very comprehensive and dense settlements, but they're not the capital city. And as we understand in the late 20th century, capital cities are an animal unto themselves. The culture of capital cities, the culture of New York, of London, of Paris, is very different from the culture of provincial cities. And these architects did urban buildings in the provincial cities as well as in the villages, but they don't have anything to do with the capital culture.
In the light of all the discussions that have happened here, in that case, do you think referring to this kind of architecture as organic architecture is actually applicable? Because it seems that the organic and sustainability aspect of the work seems to be a post-rationalization of the cultural development of these particular architects. Do you see what I mean? Because
Yes.
it seems